Hello and welcome to the FlexPro YouTube channel. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification button. And as always, let us know in the comments below what videos you want to see next and any questions you might have. So this week, we're going to go over some of the top myths of the fitness industry. Things such as, is the anabolic window real? Are carbs before bed the thing that is stopping you from attaining your goal physique? And a question that we've been told our entire lives, is breakfast truly the most important meal of the day? Stick with us as we answer all of these questions and many more. Now let's jump into it.
So this week we're going to take a closer look at the idea that you should consume protein within 30 to 60 minutes following a workout. So this is the so-called anabolic window. So first, where did this myth come from? So for a long time, bodybuilders have consumed protein powders or high protein foods after training. And the theory says that since weight training is a damaging process to muscle, creating micro tears and so on, then it makes sense that you should repair that muscle and flick on the anabolic switch, as it were, as quickly as possible after training. Now, taken to the extreme, some bodybuilders will argue that if you miss your protein feeding within that hour after your workout, then you more or less wasted that entire workout because you missed the anabolic window. And I will say that this isn't just bro science. The anabolic window has found its place in the scientific peer-reviewed literature as a legitimate hypothesis. In 2002, Lemon and colleagues spoke of a limited anabolic window of opportunity for post-workout anabolism. And a 2013 review from Ivy and Ferguson made a big deal out of nutrient timing, suggesting that when carbs and protein are ingested in the minutes post-exercise, glucose and amino acids initiate the shift to an anabolic state. And the authors recommend getting your post-workout nutrients in within 45 minutes of training. And this is based on a good chunk of evidence. They cited a total of 134 papers in their review. So maybe there is something to this myth after all, but before we jump to any conclusions, let's look at where it might have gone wrong. So where did it go wrong? Well, the very same year the Ivy paper was published in the American Journal of Lifestyle Medicine, Brad Schoenfeld, Alan Aragon, and Jim Krieger published a meta-analysis analyzing 20 studies that met a strict inclusion criteria. And lo and behold, after crunching all the data, it turns out a, quote, small to moderate effect was seen for protein timing on lean mass gain. However, what changed the game was a sub-analysis, which showed that the majority of the hypertrophic differences noted in the timing studies, including many of those in the Ivy review, could be explained entirely by differences in total daily protein intake. So basically, many of the studies touting a positive effect of nutrient timing simply had the subjects in the post-workout group eating more total protein for the day. And this led the authors to conclude that the results would seem to refute the commonly held belief that the timing of protein intake in the immediate pre- and post-workout period is critical to muscular adaptation. But there is a little bit more to it than that. We've known as early as 1997 that weight training alone results in a long-lasting elevation in muscle protein synthesis for at least 48 hours after training. And just look at this figure from a 2014 review out of McMaster University. What we're seeing here is that resistance training stimulates a prolonged elevation of muscle protein synthesis that can remain elevated for at least 48 hours after training. And the initial spike in sensitivity to amino acids appears to be about 2.5 to 3 hours, much broader of a window than the previously proposed 45 minutes. Schoenfeld also notes in a later 2017 paper, the interval for protein intake may be as wide as several hours, or perhaps more, after a training bout, depending on when the pre-workout meal was consumed. And I think that this is an important point. If amino acids are still in the system from the pre-workout meal, the specific timing of the post-workout meal is clearly of less critical importance. And for this reason, Schoenfeld and others have proposed that there's a roughly 4 to 6 hour window around the training session. So let's say you eat your pre-workout meal 1 hour before training, and then you train for an hour, you'd still have 3 or 4 hours in the post-workout period to still hit the window. On the other hand, if you happen to train fasted, or maybe you haven't eaten for 2 to 3 hours before your workout, then it'd be more important to get that post-workout protein in faster. And you might want to get it in within that first hour or so after training. So for some more clarity on this, a 2017 position stand from the International Society of Sports Nutrition recommends post-exercise ingestion of protein immediately to 2 hours following training. But they also suggest that the pragmatic recommendation is to feed as soon as possible after the workout, since not eating doesn't offer any benefit for hypertrophy. So coming full circle, I think my biggest gripe with the anabolic window is that people view it as exactly that, a window that's closing, and once it's closed after a half an hour, or 2 hours, then you missed that opportunity for gains. But we know it simply doesn't work like that. We know that weight training primes the muscle to be more sensitive to amino acids for at least 24 to 48 hours after training, and in the context of sufficient total daily protein intake, the specific timing of post-workout protein matters much less. And rather than think of post-workout anabolic signaling as an on-off switch, where you can either flick it on within that first hour following training, or it just remains off, I like to instead think of it as a sort of turn dial, where you can turn it up to varying degrees based on how you dose and how you time your protein feedings. But if you happen to miss time or underdose them a little bit, you can still get that dial turned most of the way up and still make a great deal of progress. You shouldn't eat carbs past, say, 6 or 7 p.m. Because at night, you're so much more likely to store those carbs as fat. So before we get into taking this myth down, let's first take a look at where this myth got started. So I think that the myth comes from two main lines of reasoning. So we're just gonna look at both of them one at a time and then bust them in turn. So the first theory goes that your metabolism slows down while you sleep, and so you should limit your carb intake within some proximity to bedtime because you'll just be so much more likely to store it as fat than to burn it as fuel. But before we can tackle this, I think it's first important to clarify what we mean by metabolism in this context. Here, we're basically using it to refer to metabolic rate, which determines basically your total daily energy expenditure, or TDEE, which is itself a measure of how many calories you burn in a matter of 24 hours. And there are four main components that occupy your total daily energy expenditure. So the first component is resting metabolic rate, or RMR, which is basically the energy your body needs just to keep its internal functions going. So if you just sat on the couch all day long, you'd still burn this many calories, and it actually occupies roughly half of your total metabolic rate. And then the other half is split between EAT, or exercise activity thermogenesis, so the calories you burn when you exercise, NEAT, or NEAT, which stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis. So these are the calories you burn through daily activity, but not exercise. So things like just getting groceries, or fidgeting at your desk. And then there's a small sliver for the thermic effect of meals. So when you sleep, you won't be exercising, going to get groceries, or eating any food. So those top three components won't apply. So what we're really concerned with when it comes to sleep metabolism is resting metabolic rate, or RMR. And I think that the real question we need to ask is, does RMR during the day differ from RMR at night? Because otherwise sleep, in terms of energy expenditure, wouldn't really be any different from any other time point in the day when you're just resting. And as it turns out, resting energy expenditure during sleep doesn't really differ from resting energy expenditure during the day. And this was shown by Seal and Conway, who found that overnight metabolic rate and basal, or resting metabolic rate, are equivalent. And in fact, research from Zhang and colleagues showed that sleep metabolic rate does tend to be lower than resting metabolic rate for obese subjects, but actually higher than resting metabolic rate in healthy, non-obese subjects. So pooled together, they ultimately found that sleep metabolic rate and waking metabolic rate were basically the same, with an average sleep to awake metabolic ratio of 1.0011. So they were almost exactly the same. So taken together, it really seems to be the case that eating carbs at night is really no different than eating carbs, say, at your lunchtime meal, and then just going back to your desk at rest, basically. There's nothing special about eating carbs late at night, simply on the basis of metabolic differences. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day, so we'll look at the effect of skipping breakfast on weight loss, body composition, and just general health. So first, where did the idea that breakfast is the most important meal come from? Well, Good Health magazine published an article in 1917 arguing outright that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, and it shouldn't be eaten hurriedly, and all the family should partake of it together. Of course, no actual scientific evidence was given to suggest why it might be so important, but given that John Harvey Kellogg, the inventor of cornflakes, was an editor for Good Health at the time, probably had a lot to do with getting this idea out to the general public. Plus, I think in the absence of evidence, it does seem like a pretty logical stance to take. As the argument goes, you want to eat food first thing in the morning to sort of get the nutrients and energy that your body needs to get your day started off right. But before we test this hypothesis against actual peer-reviewed scientific literature, I think it's important to first clarify exactly what we mean by breakfast. So literally speaking, breakfast simply means to break a fast. So technically speaking, whenever your first meal of the day is, that would be your breakfast. But I don't think this is a very practical definition. So we're going to use the definition established by Betts and colleagues in 2016 and just count breakfast as any meal containing at least 50 calories eaten within 2 hours of waking. And I think a good place to start in answering this question is with a 2014 study from Betts and colleagues where they investigated the effect of skipping breakfast on metabolism. And as you can see here in the graph, there is no difference in resting metabolic rate between the groups. This kind of puts to rest the myth that eating breakfast sort of stokes the metabolic furnace and gets your metabolism running for the day. And because diet-induced thermogenesis occupies such a small sliver of total daily energy expenditure, the differences here aren't likely to be significant. However, just notice the gap in physical activity thermogenesis. As it turns out, the breakfast skipping group burned significantly less calories through physical activity. And this has been described in other research as a sort of compensatory feedback mechanism, where the body tries to defend against a perceived energy deficit from the fasting, or from breakfast skipping, by reducing physical activity. So since breakfast eaters tend to burn more calories through physical activity, on the face of it, this really does seem like a point for eating breakfast and a strike against fasting, and it might be. But remember that this only covers the energy outside of the equation. We also need to look at what happens on the energy inside when you skip breakfast. So in other words, does skipping breakfast cause you to overeat later in the day? And the simple answer to this is yes, but not enough to offset the deficit from actually skipping breakfast. This same study from Betts et al. Showed that when subjects skipped a 700-calorie breakfast, they only overate throughout the rest of the day by 161 calories on average. So the skippers still ended up eating 539 calories less than the folks eating the full breakfast. So now it seems like this is really a point scored for the breakfast skippers, but you need to remember that while breakfast skippers do tend to eat fewer calories, they also tend to burn fewer calories. So on balance, there actually isn't all that much difference between breakfast skipping and breakfast eating. And this led the authors to conclude later that, taken collectively, these observations begin to explain why a resolution to start skipping breakfast may not predict the degree of weight loss one might expect. And as a practical takeaway for weight loss, I think that your decision to eat or skip breakfast should be tailored to your specific needs. From my own coaching perspective, I've noticed that some people will wake up with a really huge appetite, and in that case, I think eating breakfast would make sense to sort of set your hunger at bay while being careful to moderate your caloric intake throughout the rest of the day. Others, myself included, find their appetite is actually quite low first thing in the morning, but then picks up throughout the course of the day. And in that case, I think it also makes sense to sort of work with your body and coordinate the spacing of your meals in accordance with your own hunger patterns by sort of skewing your caloric intake to be predominantly later in the day. Ultimately, for weight loss, it should be no surprise for regular viewers of this channel and this series that net energy balance is ultimately what's driving net fat balance. So from a dieting perspective, you should be eating according to a meal schedule that allows you to adhere to and maintain a caloric deficit the best. But that is just simple weight loss, after all. What about muscle mass and body composition? Well, in this case, there are two potential concerns that I think I'd have. While some folks really do seem to perform well in the gym while fasted, in my coaching experience, I would say that more people are stronger and more fatigue resistance when they've eaten some sort of pre-workout meal. And as mentioned in the Betts review, if your morning will involve physical exercise, with performance on that day being a priority, then consuming a carbohydrate-rich breakfast is the most important meal. However, if you train later in the day or find training fasted works well for you, then breakfast is obviously going to be of much less importance. Also, I'd say from a hypertrophy perspective, skipping breakfast might not be the most optimal thing. I think we just need more data on this to know for sure. But based on muscle protein synthetic research, it does seem that having 4 or 5 meals per day with at least 20 grams of protein in each meal is best. Of course, if you, say, delay breakfast only until noon, and then have your last meal just before bed, you can easily still get those 4 or 5 meals in. But if you begin to delay breakfast further and further, sort of narrowing that eating window more and more, I think you do increase your risk of missing your sort of maximum potential for stimulating muscle protein synthesis. And granted, this is a developing area of research, and there's a lot to cover here. So I'd recommend listening to my interview with protein researcher Jorn Tromelin for more on that. But I think the bottom line is that from a muscle building perspective, extreme delays in that first meal may not be the most optimal, but as long as total daily protein intake is sufficient, so say 0.8 to 1 grams of protein per pound, how you space that out probably has no measurable impact.
Well, there you have it, folks. We hope this answers all questions that you might have had. And if you do have more questions, like we said, comment down below. We love answering any questions you have. It doesn't always have to be specifically about food and macros and things of that nature. We'll answer any and all of your questions to the best of our ability. And we just wanted to say thank you so much for sticking with us, for all your support, and we look forward to seeing you all in the next video.